Welcome back to Dr. Finance. Today I'm going to read a part of the book The Road to Serfdom, written by Friedrich August von Hayek, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, his most influential book. The Road to Serfdom, whose PDF file is freely available and was written in 1944. And then here, chapter 2. The Great Utopia. What has always made the state a hell on earth has been precisely that man has tried to make it his heaven. Hölderlin. That socialism has displaced liberalism as the doctrine held by a great majority of progressives does not simply mean that people had forgotten the warnings of the great liberal thinkers of the past about the consequences of collectivism. It has happened because they were persuaded of the very opposite of what these men had predicted. The extraordinary thing is that the same socialism that was not only early recognized as the gravest threat of freedom, but quite openly began as a reaction against the liberalism of the French Revolution, gained general acceptance under the flag of liberty. It is rarely remembered now that socialism in its beginnings was frankly authoritarian. The French writers who laid the foundations of modern socialism had no doubt that their ideas could be put into practice only by a strong dictatorial government. To them, socialism meant an attempt to terminate the revolution by a deliberate reorganization of society on hierarchical lines and the imposition of a coercive spiritual power. Where freedom was concerned, the founders of socialism made no bones about their intentions. Freedom of thought they regarded as the root evil of 19th century society and the first of modern planners. Saint-Simon even predicted that those who did not obey his proposed planning boards would be treated as cattle. Only under the influence of the strong democratic currents preceding the revolution of 1848 did socialism begin to ally with itself with the forces of freedom. But it took the new democratic socialism a long time to live down the suspicion aroused by its antecedents. Nobody saw more clearly than the de Tocqueville that democracy as an essentially individualist institution stood in an irreconcilable conflict with socialism. Democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom, he said in 1848. Socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism have nothing in common but one word: equality. But notice the difference. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. To allay these suspicions and to harness to its cart the strongest of all political motives, the craving for freedom, socialism began increasingly to make use of the promise of a new freedom. The coming of socialism was to be the leap from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom. It was to bring economic freedom, without which the political freedom already gained was not worth having. Only socialism was capable of effecting the consummation of the age-long struggle for freedom, in which the attainment of political freedom was but a first step. The subtle change in meaning to which the word freedom was subjected in order that this argument should sound plausible is important. To the great apostles of political freedom, the word had meant freedom from coercion, freedom from arbitrary power of other men, release from the ties which left the individual no choice but obedience to the orders of a superior to whom he was attached. The new freedom promised, however, was to be freedom from necessity, release from the compulsion of the circumstances which inevitably limit the range of choice of all of us, although for some vary much more than for others. Before man could be truly free, the despotism of physical want had to be broken, the restraints of the economic system relaxed. Freedom in this sense is, of course, merely another name for power or wealth. Yet, although the promises of this new freedom were often coupled with irresponsible promises of a great increase in material wealth in socialist society, it was not from such an absolute conquest of the niggardliness of nature that economic freedom was expected. What the promise really amounted to was the great existing disparities in the range of choice of different people were to disappear. The demand for the new freedom was thus only another name for the old demand for an equal distribution of wealth. But the new name gave the socialists another word in common with the liberals, and they exploited it to the full. And although the word was used in a different sense by the two groups, few people noticed this, and still fewer asked themselves whether the two kinds of freedom promised really could be combined. There can be no doubt that the promise of greater freedom has become one of the most effective weapons of socialist propaganda, and that the belief that socialism would bring freedom is genuine and sincere. But this would only heighten the tragedy of its tragedy if it should prove that what was promised to us as the road to freedom was in fact the high road to servitude. Unquestionably, the promise of more freedom was responsible for luring more and more liberals along the socialist road, for blinding them to the conflict which exists between the basic principles of socialism and liberalism, and for often enabling socialists to usurp the very name of the old party of freedom. Socialism was embraced by the great part of the intelligentsia as the apparent heir of the liberal tradition. Therefore, it is not surprising that to them the idea should appear inconceivable of socialism leading to the opposite of liberty. In recent years, however, the old apprehensions of the unforeseen consequences of socialism have once more been strongly voiced from the most unexpected quarters. Observer after observer, in spite of the contrary expectation with which he approached his subject, has been impressed with the extraordinary similarity in many respects of the conditions under fascism and communism. While progressives in the country and elsewhere were still deluding themselves that communism and fascism represented opposite poles, more and more people began to ask themselves whether these new tyrannies were not the outcome of the same tendencies. Even communists must have been somewhat shaken by such testimonies as that of Mr. Max Eastman, Lenin's old friend, who found himself compelled to admit that instead of being better, Stalinism is worse than fascism. more ruthless, barbarous, unjust, immoral, anti-democratic, unredeemed by any hope or scruple, and that it is better described as super-fascist. And when we find the same author recognizing that Stalinism is socialism in the sense of being an inevitable, although unforeseen, political accompaniment of the nationalization and collectivization which he had relied upon as part of his plan for erecting a classless society, his conclusion clearly achieves wider significance. Mr. Eastman's case is perhaps the most remarkable, yet he is by no means the first or the only sympathetic observer of the Russian experiment to form similar conclusions. Several years earlier, Mr. W.H. Chamberlain, who in 12 years in Russia as an American correspondent had seen all his ideals shattered, summed up the conclusion of his studies there and in Germany and Italy in the statement that socialism is certain to prove, in the beginning at least, the road not to freedom but to dictatorship and counter-dictatorship, to civil war of fiercest kind. Socialism achieved and maintained by democratic means seems definitely to belong to the world of utopias. Similarly, a British writer, Mr. F.A. Voigt, after many years of close observation of developments in Europe as a foreign correspondent, concludes that Marxism has led to fascism and National Socialism because, in all essentials, it is fascism and National Socialism. And Dr. Walter Lippmann has arrived at the conviction that the generation to which we belong is now learning from experience what happens when men retreat from freedom to a coercive organization of their affairs. Though they promise themselves a more abundant life, they must, in practice, renounce it as the organized direction increases. The variety of ends must give way to uniformity. That this, the nemesis of planned society and the authoritarian principle in human affairs. That is the nemesis of the planned society and the authoritarian principle in human affairs. Many more similar statements from people in a position to judge might be selected from publications of recent years, particularly from those by men who, as citizens of the now totalitarian countries, have lived through the transformation and have been forced by their experience to revise many cherished beliefs. We shall quote as one more example a German writer who expresses the same conclusion, perhaps more justly than those already quoted. The complete collapse of the belief in the attainability of freedom and equality through Marxism, writes Mr. Peter Drucker, has forced Russia to travel the same road towards a totalitarian, purely negative, non-economic society of unfreedom and inequality, which Germany has been following. That now communism and fascism are essentially the same. Not that communism and fascism are essentially the same. Fascism is the stage reached after communism has proved an illusion, and it has proved as much an illusion in Stalinist Russia as in pre-Hitler Germany. No less significant is the intellectual history of many of the Nazi and fascist leaders. Everybody who has watched the growth of these movements in Italy or Germany has been struck by the number of leading men from Mussolini downwards, and not excluding Laval and Quisling, who began as socialists and ended as fascists or Nazis. And what is true of the leaders is even more true of the rank and file of the movement. The relative ease with which a young communist could be converted into a Nazi or vice versa was generally known in Germany, best of all to the propagandists of the two parties. Many a university teacher in this country during the 1930s has seen English and American students return from the continent uncertain whether they were communists or Nazists, and certain only that they hated Western liberal civilization. It is true, of course, that Germany before 1933 and in Italy before 1922, communists and Nazis or fascists clashed more frequently with each other than with other parties. They competed for the support of the same type of mind and reserved for each other the hatred of the heretic. But their practice showed how closely they are related to both the real enemy, the men with whom they had nothing in common and whom they could not hope to convince, is the liberal of the old type, while to the Nazi, the communist, and to the communists, the Nazi, and to both the socialist, are potentially recruits who are made of the right timber. Although they have listened to false prophets, they both know that there can be no compromise between them and those who really believe in individual freedom. Lest this be doubted by people misled by official propaganda from either side, let me quote one more statement from an authority that ought not be suspect. In an article under the significant title of The Rediscovery of Liberalism, Professor Edward Heimann, one of the leaders of German religious socialism, writes, Hitlerism proclaims itself as both true democracy and true socialism, and the terrible truth is that there is a grain of truth for such claims. An infinitesimal grain, to be sure, but at any rate enough to serve as a basis for such fantastic distortions. Hitlerism even goes so far as to claim the role of protector of Christianity, and the terrible truth is that even this gross misinterpretation is able to make some impression. But one fact stands out with perfect clarity in all the fog. Hitler has never claimed to represent true liberalism. Liberalism then has the distinction of being the doctrine most hated by Hitler. It should be added that this hatred had little occasion to show itself in practice merely because by the time Hitler came to power, liberalism was to all intents and purposes dead in Germany, and it was socialism that had killed it. While to many who have watched the tradition from socialism to fascism at close quarters of connection between the two systems has become increasingly obvious in this country, the majority of people still believe that socialism and freedom can be combined. There can be no doubt that most socialism here still believe profoundly in the liberal ideal of freedom, and that they would recoil if they became convinced that the realization of the program would mean the destruction of freedom. So little is the problem yet seen. So easily do the most irreconcilable ideals still live together that we can still hear such contradictions in terms as individualist socialism seriously discussed. If this is the state of mind which makes us drift into a new world, nothing can be more urgent than that we should seriously examine the real significance of the evolution that has taken place elsewhere. Although our conclusions will only confirm the apprehensions which others have already expressed, the reasons why this development cannot be regarded as accidental will not appear without a rather full examination of the main aspects of this transformation of social life. That democratic socialism, the great utopia of the last few generations, is not only unachievable, but that to strive for it produces something so utterly different that few of those who now wish it would be prepared to accept the consequences. Many will not believe till the connection has been laid bare in all its aspects. Thanks for listening.